Hello everybody, we are going, Dr. Rash, we will start.
Okay, we're starting.
Yes, we are starting because people have a class.
They have a class afterwards. Okay, well,
so let me introduce
okay, you're going to introduce
I would
me.
like, ladies, please to introduce our guest, Professor Felicity Rash. She's a professor of linguistics at Queen Mary University of London. She has taught English and German linguistics with particular emphasis on sociolinguistics as well as on English, French, German language courses. She has, mashallah, 35 years of experience in the field. She presents various research in different fields regarding the discourse analysis. She has also published books intensively. The latest one I have here in front of me is which is already published in 2019, will show up, but she had one in 2016. So please.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to talk about some poetry from the First World War, which ended exactly 100 years ago. And so in Europe, this is quite a large theme for research and for discussion, because we look at the literature and the poetry and the journalism of that time to see if anything was learnt as a result of fighting that war, and wondering if anything has changed, if some things are still the same and some things have changed. Now these poets, they actually changed their view of their war during the war, which is quite significant. So we're going to look at a selection where we see how their views actually changed between 1914, when the war started, and 1918, when it ended. And of course it was a world war. People tend to think of it, particularly in Europe, where everybody thinks Eurocentrically. We think we're the centre of the world. We seem to think, oh well, it was just Europeans fighting this war. It was just the British, the Germans and the French. It was a world war. More or less everybody in the world was involved. And one of your poems, Mesopotamia, the third one of your selection, actually deals specifically with what is now Iraq, where people were fighting over the oil that they wanted for the future, for themselves. So the Germans wanted the oil, the British and Americans wanted the oil. So this, in a sense, was a start of some historical situations which then developed over the last century. We're going to be looking at a male poet and a female poet. The first poet, Rudyard Kipling, you've probably heard of Jungle Book, which he wrote. He's very famous for having written the Jungle Book, but he was also a journalist. He was quite old at the start of the First World War, so he couldn't go to fight himself. He was born in India, so his attitudes were imperialist, and he was very much full of his sense of duty. He didn't even go to Britain to live till he was 5 years old, and he only spoke Hindi for the first 5 years of his life. But his British colonialist background gave him this idea: we have this great empire, we are better than everybody else, we have something great to defend. Anybody that attacks us in our secure world is really a very fearsome enemy. And in many senses, the struggle to get colonies caused the First World War, because Germany wanted colonies, Britain wanted colonies. They wanted the riches that were available in places like Africa and Asia and the Caribbean, and they wanted world power. And so at the very start of the war, the British wanted people like Rudyard Kipling, who was a well-known poet, a poet laureate. He had a Nobel Prize for literature. They wanted great names to write poetry and newspaper articles to encourage young men to want to go and fight. And this is what Rudyard Kipling did. The war broke out in August 1914, and then in September 1914 he published in the Times this poem, For All We Have and Our. And we have to think, well, what is this thing that we have? And who are these people that we are? And for Rudyard Kipling, this meant a sense of duty to the empire, to the nation, and to God. And things have changed massively in Europe over the last 100 years. 100 years ago, they speak of it as the age of deference, when young people in particular deferred to their parents, their teachers, their priests at church, their prime minister, their king, and to God. And they were told, you must obey, you must have a sense of duty, you must be courageous, you must look to your masculine virtues or your feminine virtues, depending on which you are. At the beginning of the war, there was no compulsory military service, so there was only a small standing army for the nation to call upon. This was a political, it was considered to be a political mistake, because people who had been imagining there would be a war were going round schools saying to young boys, you've got to think of joining the army, you've got to be prepared for a war. But when the war broke out, they needed young men to join up. So this poem is addressed at the young men who were supposed to go and join the army, and they did in their thousands, because they thought, they didn't understand what a dreadful war it was going to be, because their idea of war was men riding around on horsebacks, maybe a few guns, maybe a few swords. They didn't know that there would be this horrible machinery, these really powerful guns, and how much in danger they would be. They also thought that it would be a quick-fought war over in 4 months, and that would be that, and they would be home again, they would be heroes. So in this poetry, particularly the last one, as long as we get that far, the idea of what happened to the men who came home as heroes after 4 years and how they were able to fit into society. So what they had, you imagine it's their traditions, their values, their history of greatness, and their empire that they had to defend. How do you convince them they've got to defend? You have to instill fear into them. You have to say there is a great threat here. And so this is a discourse strategy of instilling fear into people. If we look at the first strophe here, for all we have an hour, for all our children's fate, stand up and take the war. The Hun is at the gate. The Hun was the German, and he's threatening, he's outside, threatening to come in. The gate is a metaphor for the threat of him coming in to us, invading us. And there was a very strong theme in Germany and Britain at the beginning of the First World War, that social traditions were being destroyed and people were becoming too capitalistic and materialistic. Men were drinking too much, even women were drinking and smoking, and society was going to pot, basically. So one of the messages was, you've got to bring our world back to what it should be and bring our traditional values back. And this is what he means when he's saying, in wantonness o'erthrown, our world has passed away. Things aren't how they should be. We've got to bring things back. There is nothing left today but steel and fire and stone. So those are the metaphors for war. What do you think of this language? Well, we'll compare it when we get to the poetry written by a woman.
Okay.
It's very masculine, isn't it? Quite aggressive. It's, you have got to fight, you've got to defend us from this terrible Hun. And then there's a strophe which people can imagine that they're singing to themselves. Though all we knew depart and old commandments stand, in courage kept your heart, in strength lift up your hand. So courage is important. In the strophe on the right hand side, in patience keep your heart. All of these things have got to be built up in the young people who were 16, 17, 18 years old, who didn't have any idea what was happening, and sometimes their mothers would beg them not to join up, but in general their families would support them to fight.
They conscripted at 16?
They weren't conscripted, they had to volunteer. Conscription came in 2 years later because they desperately needed soldiers, and you didn't have the conscription until much later when it was desperate. So these are boys who are being asked to volunteer. Now, if any of you have done discourse analysis, you may have heard of the topos of history as a teacher, where in discourse you're given an example of history and you're told you've got to learn from this so it doesn't happen again. The next strophe, once more we hear the word that sickened earth of old, no law except the sword, unsheathed and uncontrolled. This is referring back to the wars of the past, which Britain always seemed to win. They fought France, they fought Spain, they were full of self-confidence. We're the greatest, our army is going to win everything. But they were being reminded we've had to fight in the past and this is going to happen again. And then it says, once more it knits mankind, once more the nations go to meet and break and bind a crazed and driven foe. Again, the foe, the enemy, the Germans are dangerous, they're mad, they're crazed, they're driven by their ambition, by their aggression. So you've got to defend your country again. And the next strophe, the third one, comfort, content, delight, the ages slow bought gain, they trivelled in a night, only ourselves remain, to face the naked days in silent fortitude, through perils and dismayed, renewed and renewed. This is optimistic. This is showing what ourselves can do. We have our national characteristics. We're British, we're great, we have all our national virtues. We are going, with our fortitude, we are going to win through. Now, this doesn't mean to say Rudyard Kipling was in favour of the war. He wasn't obviously in favour of war. He was being patriotic and convincing young men they should fight to defend their nation. So he was in favour of patriotic duty. And when we look at the next two poems, you'll see what happens. So the last strophe is all about iron sacrifice of your body, your will and your soul. At the same time, German poets were writing exactly the same thing. And the word iron, strength, solidity was coming into their poetry at exactly the same time. And finally, now this is very important because we'll come back to this, there is but one task for all, one life for each to give. You might have to give your life, and you must be proud to give your life. There were many more people 100 years ago were devout Christians than are in our present day in Europe. Yes. So they really did believe that if they gave their life for their country, that they would get their reward. So that helped them massively. It didn't help them 100% when they were under fire in France, but it did help them make their minds up at that particular time. And then the final two sentences, they are in the subjunctive mood, which is very rare in English nowadays, and my students can't recognize it. What stands if freedom fall? That literally means what stands if freedom were to fall. Our freedoms would die at the hands of the enemy. And who dies if England were to live? So that's the subjunctive mood, because this is 100 years ago. People used the subjunctive if nowadays. So England has got to live, to be or not to be. And the Germans were saying exactly the same thing. If we don't fight this terrible British enemy, we will not have a colony in Africa, we will not have colonies abroad, we will not survive. So they were both saying exactly the same thing. Do you have any questions about that poem? It's quite optimistic, it's very masculine.
But it's obviously very early.
Very early, before he had any idea what was going to happen.
Anything happening, what are the detrimental...
And also he's older, he's in his 40s, so his idea of war, he has seen war, but it was an old-fashioned kind of war.
It actually reminds me of the same idea of, first of all, it's highly argumentative.
Yes.
the rhetoric. He uses
Yeah.
the style of rhetoric.
Yes.
Where he has all ideas in order. He knows his audience and he knows what he's going to say.
Yes.
And what ticks with them when you said that he invokes Christianity and the death for the sake of they'll be rewarded after death, even if they sacrifice their lives. But it's very masculine in the sense it reminds me strongly of the Romans, when like Virgil's
Yes.
the Odyssey, when they went to fight,
Yes.
Odysseus, and also the Iliad by Homer, when Achilles was starting the war and Agamemnon was trying to convince people, the Greeks, to go and fight the Trojans and sacrifice themselves for the sake of their own.
Yes. That's a very important point, because people of Rudyard Kipling's generation had that education.
I see.
He would have read these texts at school, whereas nowadays they don't.
They don't, yes.
So he would be familiar with that rhetoric and be able to make use of it. And he was trained as a journalist. And the Times is for educated people as well. But the teachers would read it, and the priests would read it, and the landowners would read it, and then they would go to their villages and say, have you seen this article? Oh, no, you haven't seen this poem in the newspaper. Oh, I've read it, and it says, and Rudyard Kipling, our great poet, is telling you that you have to go and fight. So this Roman tradition and the Greek tradition is very important, which we've lost all of that. We don't have that in the education system anymore. But the next poem, My Boy Jack, is completely different, because he sent his son. His son wanted to join up at the beginning of the war, and he encouraged his son to fight. His son was lost in battle, and nobody knew for years if he'd actually died. His body wasn't ever found. And Rudyard Kipling was eventually put in charge of designing war memorials. I don't know if it was because of this, but this poem is about his lost son. His son was called John. Jack is a nickname for John. My Boy Jack. So he's writing it for all people who've lost a son, not just for himself, but it's a question and answer.
So this was 1 year after.
1 year after, when he's in despair.
Yeah.
And the question is in ordinary type, and then the answer is in italics. So as you look down the poem, compare the first strophe with the last strophe, what do you notice? All italics at the end. The first is a normal question and answer. When you learn about conversational analysis, you learn that you ask a question, you get an answer. You think you expect an answer, you think you're entitled to an answer.
Adjacency, okay.
So here you have questions. Have you news of my boy Jack? Because he doesn't know. It's the most desperate position to be in as a parent, and he's blaming himself. Not this tide. And then, when do you think he'll come back? Not with this wind blowing and this tide. This is not very masculine. What imagery, what does it bring to your mind when you see it all the way through, not with this tide, not with this wind blowing? What does it bring to your mind when you...
It's the sea.
It's the sea and the wind, nature.
It's the idea that people come with
the
ships from war to back home, and the idea, and the tide takes
Takes
away
people
actually,
away.
Yeah, tide takes people away
And brings
from
them
home
back
rather
also.
than...
Yeah.
Well, the image is usually that tide is an aggressive.
Tide can be aggressive, wind can be aggressive.
Yeah, so it's this idea that they take people away, but they never come back.
Yes.
But it's also news, because tides, people in old time, they throw bottles in the sea, and the tides will bring them to
Yes,
the shore.
but it says not with this
Yes.
tide. There's going to be no
Yes.
bottle coming back with this tide. No news is going to come back. So it's sorrow and despair with no answer. And also, nature is not controllable.
Yes.
And it's not predictable. You can't say, the wind will do this for me, or there will be a wind, the tide will do this for me. It's completely unpredictable, so he's in a state of what is going to happen. And if you look at the end, we haven't got enough time to look. It's quite a simple poem. It's very easy to understand what he's getting at, but you look at the end. Then hold your head up all the more, be proud. This tide and every tide, because he was the son you bore. This is a very full answer. And gave to that wind blowing. So in the first poem you've got your lives to give. Here the father is being told, you gave your son to the wind and the tide, to uncertainty and war and not knowing. So that's two kinds of giving. And then in the next poem,
And he did not shame his kind, so he was courageous.
oh, he was courageous. Yes, he did not shame his kind. Not even with that wind blowing.
Yeah.
The even there is an important little word, because it's in desperately difficult circumstances. The war is like a storm which has happened. A storm is a metaphor often used for war, and even though this wind is blowing, he was courageous. Because they were all courageous. They didn't know if they weren't courageous and they ran away, they were shot in the back. People are a little bit more sympathetic to young soldiers nowadays, but in those days it's different. But Kipling, after another 2 years, and he wrote this poem Mesopotamia, he had changed his mind even more, because he was seeing young soldiers doing all the fighting, and he was seeing the politicians sitting back in their countries, the kings and emperors who asked for the war in the first place, sitting in their palaces. Out in Mesopotamia, the few high-ranking army officials who did go out there were sitting behind the fighting, often drinking whiskey. They had their record players taken out to them, they had music, they had servants waiting on them hand and foot, and they were sending the boys knowing that they would probably get killed and seemingly not caring. And Rudyard Kipling was coming to the knowledge that this was going on, and he wasn't the only person. A lot of people, it was not encouraged to write anti-war poetry, least of all in 1917. You couldn't say this is a bad war. You couldn't tell people not to go because conscription had come into force, and if you didn't go you were put in prison or you were made to go and work on a farm, and people would treat you very, very badly. If they saw you weren't at war, they would give you a white feather.
Not patriotic.
As being a coward. You weren't being patriotic, you weren't fighting for your country, and you weren't defending your future generations, your children and your families for the future. But now the reality is coming into line, and Kipling is thinking this is not right. And this whole poem, it's quite a long, complicated poem, and it's very, very critical, and it's very, very bold. They shall not return to us, the resolute, the young. It's pessimistic now. He's moved completely from optimism to pessimism. The eager and wholehearted whom we gave. Again, this giving. We gave. The country gave our young people, and now we know they're being sent. They were referred to as cannon fodder. But the men who left them thriftily to die in their own dung, shall they come with years and honour to the grave? The people who sent them thriftily means they were saving themselves, thriftily meaning saving, and they left them to die in their own dung. It's a horrible image, but it's what happened. They were dying in mud and dung and blood, and it was absolute. People who came back, many of them didn't recover. And
it's well known, first of all, the war of trenches, right?
Yes, yeah. Although in Mesopotamia they didn't have the trenches. They were in the mountains, being set upon from the mountains into the valleys. They didn't even have the protection of trenches, so it was even worse. And also because the Ottoman Empire was on the German side.
Yes, it was on the German.
Then each of these strophes has a question, and it's a rhetorical question, and even the last question has no answer, but it is a question of accusation. These men who sent the boys out to die, shall they come with years and honour to the grave? They will. They'll get home. They'll go home to be buried, and they will be given the honour. And they did. The generals went home and they were congratulated, and they took up their lives as they left off. And not so many, that we had a very rigid class system in those days, and not so many people cared that working class lads had gone to be killed.
There is a scene in the movie The Patriot, where it's about the the independence war in the United States. And there is the scene where the English general tells the main character, why are you killing the generals and the majors? How can we keep the control of the war like that? You kill only the soldiers in the field. And he was like, if they are part of the army, then they're going to be killed. And he relates to this idea very well. That
and also they thought they were better. They thought they had better genetic makeup, that they were in the higher classes of society because they were somehow superior. And they also, if you had Indian and African soldiers, they cared about those even less. They were dispensable because there was this idea of social hierarchy, which Rudyard Kipling grew up in. He grew up in the idea that he came from better stock than the ordinary soldiers. But now he's learned, and when he designed the war memorials, in the past the war memorials always had the officers at the top and the soldiers beneath. When he designed the First World War memorials, he changed it, and he said, we're having all people who died in alphabetical order and no separation, saying this was an officer, that was a soldier. So he learned, and at a later age, whether he would have thought so deeply if he hadn't lost his son is a different matter.
Can I say something? Because the same situation reminds me of what happened during the War of the Spanish Succession in England, which is early 18th century.
Yes.
With Duke of Marlborough was the leader, and so many people died, because it's also, we can say it's an international, because it happens between the European powers, and probably more than 1 million with the time of that counting.
Yes, it's a huge amount.
And the Queen Anne, she wanted to end the war, but to her surprise, the generals, the leaders, and one of them is Duke of Marlborough, they were making money out of this. And they refused to stop the war, in spite of the fact that they lost massive English young men.
Yes, they didn't care.
And they didn't care. But the end, he was forced to step down because the Queen refused to continue with that bloodshed.
Yes, yeah.
So it's similarly
yes, exactly.
the same.
And also, it's not just money; it was fame. If he could become a great man,
he became. Actually, they built him this massive palace, which is the Brittain Palace. After the war, after the battle he won with the French, Brittain, which was in 1705.
Yeah. But even nowadays, if you talk to people who are high up in the army, they still revere these great names. Those people still have in people's mind, the history is still valuable, and history lessons still traditionally in Great Britain involve learning more about that sort of thing than learning about ordinary people. Yeah. And there aren't so many historical records about ordinary people. There are historical records about the great generals who won the wars, and not about the ordinary people. But this is all about the people. I want to leave time to talk about Vera Brittain as well, because she's important. But if we pick out some of the important sentences, if you look at the third strophe, but the idle-minded overlings who quibbled while they died, shall they thrust for high employment as of old? The idle-minded, lazy, worthless overlings, those who are above, socially speaking, and within the army, who quibbled. They were sitting there talking and arguing, what shall we do? Shall we send them? Shall we not send them? And in the meantime, there were young men dying. And the question here is, shall they thrust to high employment as of old? When they get home, they will go back to a good job. They will go to their London club and meet their old friends and, Lord and Lady this and the Baron of that. So this is, he's getting extremely critical, which is quite brave in those days. That nowadays people say what they think, what they like. But in those days, he was saying, so what?
Especially
You listen to
war.
me, particularly during the war, because they didn't need people to be discouraged. And always at the end, if you look at the next strophe, how softly but how swiftly they have sidled back to power by the favour and contrivance of their kind. Their kind being the upper classes, favour, contrivance, sidled back to power. Sidled is a pejorative word. You go in sort of sideways, nobody notices what's going on. I'm just going to slip back to where I was before and forget the people that have died. And the final wait a minute, there's two, all strophes are important, but the second to last one, even while they soothe us, while they promise large amends, even while they make a show of fear, that hypocrisy, they're pretending to be fear, they're promising us things which they probably have no intention of doing anything about. Do they call upon their debtors and take counsel with their friends to conform and re-establish each career? Yes, they do. There's an answer to these rhetorical questions. So they go back to their friends, and the last strophe, their lives cannot repay us, their death could not undo the shame that they have laid upon our race. If you think of what he said about the likes of his son Jack, you did not bring us shame. Here they have brought shame upon our race being all British people, not just the upper class, but the slothfulness that wasted and the arrogance that slew. Shall we leave it unabated in its place? That one isn't answered.
So he calls for change.
He's calling for change
Yes.
and slothfulness and arrogance. Somebody at the top of society did not tolerate being called arrogant and slothful. It made them very angry. And I think this is a very, again, you're going back to rather masculine language again. If a woman had written that, she would have been in serious trouble, because when we're going to start on Vera Brittain soon, women were not encouraged to write at all. When they did write, their work was criticised and it was classed as second class. So when we look at the first poem, we have to decide if we think it's second class, because it's different. Now, Vera Brittain was a middle class lady.
I'm sorry, when you say they were not encouraged to write at all, write about war, you mean?
No, at all.
Ah.
In the 19th century, they often published under men's names, except for Jane Austen and the big ones, Charlotte Bronte and so on, but they weren't even as revered, greatly revered as, say, for
George
example,
Eliot
Charles
was
Dickens.
writing under-
She was writing under a man's
Even
name.
the Bronte sisters, they wrote under
To start with,
Bell
yeah. So they weren't. Now, Vera Brittain, she went to university in 1914. I'm very interested in her because my grandmother was her best friend at Oxford. So when I was a young girl, I didn't know, but my grandmother used to say, I've just had a letter from my dear friend Vera. Her daughter is going to be something in politics. Her daughter is now in the House of Lords as a senior politician, but back in the 1960s, I knew about this woman, but I didn't know she was a great poet. But they were both at Oxford together. Women in those days were not given degrees. They were allowed to study with the men, go to the lectures with the men, take the exams with the men, but they weren't given a certificate to say that they had passed the exams. My grandmother wrote poetry, and her first volume of poetry was published anonymously because she was a friend of somebody called Basil Blackwell. Blackwell is a big publisher. Everybody thought it was man's poetry. But Vera Brittain didn't publish her poetry when she was at Oxford. What happened was her fiancé was killed at the beginning of the war and her brother was killed at the beginning of the war. So she left Oxford temporarily. She went back again later, but she went out into France to work as a voluntary nursing aide. She wasn't a trained nurse, so she was only doing the dirtiest of work. She was working in a ward of German soldiers, so enemy soldiers, which in her mind to start with would have been very difficult. Now it was interesting that her family allowed her to go as a young woman, which in those days wasn't automatically. Girls couldn't just do what they wanted and say, I'm going to do this. She had to have her family's permission. They gave her permission, but interestingly, in comparison with today, when her father wrote to her and said, you're coming home because your mother isn't well and the servants are misbehaving. Nowadays we don't have servants, but in those days they did. She went. And of course nowadays a young girl who is 18 would be full age anyway. In those days you weren't full age until you were 21. So, but now their father wouldn't say, you're coming home to look after this household and tell the servants what to do. You know, it just wouldn't happen. But so she went back, and then she went back to Oxford. She studied history. She wrote some books, but not a huge amount. She became politically active as a pacifist and a feminist. So she brought her daughter up to be a feminist politician, a Labour Party member. But it's quite interesting, this poem, because it is full of compassion. It's called The German Ward, written in 1916, looking back at her experiences looking after enemy soldiers, and she's writing about what she will remember. And one of the main things she will remember is the nursing sister there and the compassion that the nursing sister had. And it is quite an important message to people in Britain at the time that the enemy are people too. That a wounded man is a wounded man, and a dying man is a dying man, whether he's German or British or French, or even if he's African and Indian. They and the real nurses learned this. Now, this kind of poetry was exactly what got criticism from male poets, because it's first person, it's very direct, it's very simple, it is quite descriptive, and it is all about what she's experienced. It's not about sort of grand ideas, it's not full of nature imagery, it doesn't refer back in a style to the arguments that you were mentioning, sort of Virgil and Horace, which she would have read, but she wasn't adopting this very academic, intellectual style. So when years of strife are over and my recollection fades, of the wards wherein I worked the weeks away, I shall still see, as a vision's rising mid the wartime shades, the ward in France where German wounded laid. So it gets the message to you very quickly, very directly. You don't have to sort of start thinking about, you know, what she's saying here. You know immediately what she's saying, and it's got the sights and the sounds and the smells. And that's what makes poetry, particularly war poetry, very good, because it's very direct. You think, well, how did it sound? How did you know, what were the sounds like? What did it smell like? Nobody could have imagined. Some filmmakers went out and they filmed silent films showing what happened in the trenches and in the war, but they weren't encouraged to show too many of the horrors, because the people at home needed to be protected from that. But she's talking about what she would remember. I shall see the pallid faces and the half-suspicious eyes. Half-suspicious because these poor Germans didn't know how they were going to be treated. They were enemy, and they could have been beaten, but there were conventions about treating enemy prisoners which couldn't be broken. I shall hear the bitter groans and laboured breath, and recall the loud complaining and weary tedious cries, and the sights and smells of blood and wounds and death. Now the style here, notice how many phrases and words there are linked with and. women have been criticised in feminist, well, we've talked about it in feminist linguistic theory. Women are criticised for not using complex sentence constructions in literature and poetry, and for having too many and links of ideas, lists of ideas. But what do you think this effect is of the and?
Yeah, it enhances the imagery here with the sights and smells and winds and
Yes, exactly.
It brings it to life.
Direct.
Yeah.
It gives it a rhythm,
Yeah,
and it builds up.
yeah, and you feel like you're
Yeah.
out of breath with her.
Yes.
It's just, yeah.
Yes.
It's also usually used and at the end of a list. So you think it's the end, but no, there's more,
There is
and
more.
there's more, and
Yeah,
there's more. So
yes.
the and actually
Yeah,
gives it
yeah.
more idea of there's still more coming.
Yes.
And then
Yeah.
when she stops, I'm like, oh, okay, and now it's the next idea.
Yes, and to have and at the beginning of a line in a strophe, I mean, it's just, people would have criticised this, saying this woman doesn't know how to write.
Right, yes, not proper English grammar. Yeah.
Nowadays it's different, but in those days they had certain conventions for poetry, and you had to impress people, and this kind of being impressed wasn't rated so highly. But as you were saying, that it actually makes it more direct and more horrific.
If a man had done it, they would say, oh, it's innovative.
Ah, yeah, well, that's a point. Yes, yeah.
That's really what it would have been.
Well, this is an interesting point you make there, because the third poem, if we get there, doesn't have the rhyme, and that innovation was coming through with expressionist poetry during the First World War. Some of the conventions of poetry were being broken down, so some of the war poetry at the beginning, it was all in rhyme, as is this, but when people started to write without a rhyme at the end of each line, it was usually men, and if a man did it, okay, it's a bit risky, but
We applaud your
yeah. And the last strophe is very important, and I hope we can just get on to at least one more. I shall think of how I worked for her, this is the sister, the nursing sister, with nerve and heart and mind, and marvelled at her courage and her skill, and how the dying enemy her tenderness would find beneath her scornful energy of will. She had a mission to look after these people. This was her duty, the sister. She was the trained nurse there. And whatever she thought of the enemy, if she was a little bit scornful of them,
Yeah, that's the choice of word.
Yeah.
Yeah.
but it's just put in there as a small word, because in general she was offering comfort.
Yes.
And you don't know what was going on in her head, but she was admirable all the way through, and it
But
never
at the same time
stopped.
scornful.
Yes, at the same time scornful.
Yeah.
But how scornful, we don't know. How
Is it scornful?
reluctantly.
You have to keep going. Is it because what you're seeing is horrible and horrifying, and you need to go on? Because here
The energy.
it's the energy of will that is scornful. So
Yes, as
don't
well.
give in to your feelings of
This is the
animosity
enemy.
against the
The
enemy,
enemy,
but
yes.
at the same time, it's what she's seeing every day is
Yeah.
horrible, as we can see from the first and second.
Yeah, and the will
stanzas. So
in
it's
your
the idea
keeping your
that you have to
mind.
keep helping these people,
Yes.
regardless of how horrible it is, regardless of whether they are the enemy or not.
Yes.
It's this. Yeah.
And the momentum doesn't cease. You've still got and marvelled at her courage and her skill, and how the dying enemy her tenderness would find. So I think it's a very good poem, but as I say, at that time it was controversial. She wrote a lot of poetry later on, looking back, when she wrote her life story. A Testament of Youth is her life story about her experiences in the war. It's in that handout
Yeah,
that you've
okay.
got, A Testament of Youth.
It's been adapted into a film.
As well, that's true. And then she wrote a later book, a Testament of Experience, I think she called it, about her political life. But I've yet to find my grandmother in her Testament of Youth. She's in there somewhere with a changed name. So the next one, perhaps to R.A.L., that is to Roland Leighton, her dead fiancé. And again, first person. And again, and her feelings progress. It moves. The whole poem moves on. But there's a certain amount of despair in this poem about, will I ever overcome the loss of this person? And although bereft of you, addressing him directly, again, is there some hope? Even though I've lost the love of my life, will I still perhaps one day feel better? At the moment she doesn't. But she goes through the seasons. The first 4 strophes have got the same structure, with perhaps I will one day feel better, even though I have lost you, but I don't know, this is difficult, I don't know if this will ever happen. And she's looking at the beauty of nature. Perhaps the sun will shine for me again one day, perhaps the sky will be blue. Within nature imagery, sunshine, obviously, as you know, sunshine, blue sky, are optimistic, they're happy, but she's not feeling that. She's feeling dark at the moment. And feel once more, I do not live in vain. So perhaps I will feel that there is some purpose to my life. And she goes through the seasons, golden meadows of summer, spring, the May blossoms, which are all white and frothy in May in the English countryside. Perhaps the summer woods will shimmer bright and crimson roses once again be fair. Even looking at roses, she doesn't even think that that is a beautiful thing at the moment. And autumn harvest fields, and then going through to winter, the dying year, Christmas songs, which are supposed to cheer people up in the winter. She's saying, even though I'm bereft, maybe one day I will feel again. Maybe I didn't live in vain. The last 2 strophes, she goes back to the German ward.
Yes.
And so she's thinking, well, I didn't live in vain because I did something useful then. And then what did she find? If you look at the last strophe, what did she find in those German wards?
She's capable
Love.
of mercy.
Love, yes.
Working amongst
Human mercy in the second to last strophe, love. So she knows it's there. And she's lost the perhaps at the end. But it's almost like a work in progress, isn't it? The poem has got a shifting structure, which again, as a woman poet, if a man had done it, maybe the shifting structure and having a different structure at the end and different ideas coming in.
But comparing this to the poem by Kipling, where about my boy Jack.
Yes.
The other one is all about the answers that come back from the
Yes.
people in power who are going to answer, and they're giving you a very practical answer. The tide is not going to bring back, the wind is not going to bring. Don't feel shame. He was honorable and he gave us honor, and you gave him, and this is. But here we get actual feelings, because what we got from Rudyard Kipling is questions that don't show really feeling of how sad is he by the absence of his son, whereas here we get to see actual grief and sadness.
Yes, and doubt and hope and doubt and not knowing. Although I think with my boy Jack, I think you do get some sadness.
As a reader, you empathize with the meaning behind the lines, but
yes, because you know what it is.
What it is, but the lines don't really reveal any feelings of the poet, the speaker in the poem, right?
Yeah.
And that's the thing, the speaker is more kind of someone who's characterized but not given a voice, because that's why they're silenced at the end.
Yes,
they? They're asking about their children that they were gone. But
yes,
then, you have the more of a almost condescending way of like, not this time.
Yes,
Other time.
So
it's really interesting in that sense as well.
But you still have the not knowing. Which war was all about not knowing. You only had letters in those days. The mother sitting at home would be waiting for a letter, and then the postman would come with a telegram, and if the postman came with a telegram, you knew what would be in it. And she would look at the postman and say, you see it in films a lot.
Yes, you do.
She would look at the postman and say, no, you know, please, not for me.
Yeah.
The difference between the two is, with my boy Jack, he just didn't know anything. There was nothing to console him.
Yes.
With here, she has, I saw the goodness of the nurses towards their enemy.
Yes,
Therefore,
true.
there's human goodness. I still see goodness. We're not totally evil.
Yeah.
So here, there's something for her to console herself with. Unlike Kipling, there was...
And then with Kipling, he went on to, with the poem in Mesopotamia, criticising everything that was going wrong. Whereas this is this is later, this is at the end and after the war.
There's a tinge of hope with
There's-
Vera Brittain.
There's a tinge of hope. The last poem is a very difficult one in some ways. It's short. Linguistically, it's a little bit difficult to understand, the lament of the demobilised. But here she is adopting a more modern form, which is interesting in itself. She's moved away from the strophes, from the rhyme, from all the lines being the same length, from there being a rhythm in the poetry. But this theme was very important all the way through the war. Not just the demobilised at the end of the war was what she's writing about, which is the war is finished and everybody's coming home. But during the war, even if people went home on leave, they would come home to a complete lack of comprehension as to what they were experiencing, and people would say, "Oh, it's great fun out there, isn't it? And you're doing your bit for your country, and it's all jolly good, you know." And the soldiers coming home wouldn't necessarily tell of all the horrors unless they became ill. Now, even if a soldier became ill, if he was an officer, he would go to a good hospital. And if he were a man and suffered from shell shock, if he were just an ordinary soldier, there was much more chance that he would be shot for it. And I remember in the 1960s and 70s seeing First World War veterans who were suffering from shell shock, and they'd completely lost their minds. I remember I used to walk to work when I was about 22 years old, and I used to see a man every morning. And I do this for my students, so I'll do it for you. And he would be walking to the newsagent and back, and he would be going all the way there, all the way back, and people would say, yes, he's got shell shock. From the First World War, not the Second World War. But Vera Brittain here is writing on behalf of the people who came back at the very end, and what people said to them, and what they saw about the people who hadn't gone away, and what lack of empathy and understanding they encountered. 4 years, some would say consolingly. Oh, well, what's that? You're young. And then it must have been a very fine experience. Yeah, I mean, you know, you come back from absolute horror and you just don't know what to say. And it was the same in all countries. It was the same in Germany. I would recommend the book or the film, All Quiet on the Western Front, because that's exactly a theme that comes up in that. The soldier goes home and he goes to the bar or restaurant to have a beer with people who didn't go, and they all know better than he did about what it was like on the Western Front. And then the newspapers would say, it's all quiet on the Western Front. And it wasn't. And he couldn't talk to people. And he heard these people talking, and he left the restaurant, went home to his mother, and nobody could talk to him. Nobody could understand. And it must have been soul-destroying. And they forget how others stay behind and just got on. So some people got on with their lives and again couldn't understand. They weren't all branded as cowards. There was some farmers and bank workers and politicians and civil servants who weren't allowed to go. And so not everybody, and also the older people, if you were too old, you weren't conscripted. And they got on the better since we were away. We were left a gap for people to climb up the social ladder. And we came home and found they had achieved, and men revered their names, but never mentioned ours. So already, as soon as the war is finished, it's been forgotten. And they just got to get on with life as though nothing had ever happened. And some of them just couldn't. They were having trouble fitting back into their families. They were having nightmares. They were totally traumatized
by the whole
and they
experience.
couldn't show it because in those days men didn't talk about their feelings. Nowadays men are encouraged to talk about their feelings, and if they're depressed or suffering mentally in any way, and they're allowed to cry. In those days, if a man cried, he was ridiculed. It was dreadful. No one talked heroics now. They talked heroics when we went. They said, you will go and you will come back heroes. But when they came back, this isn't entirely true. Some were treated as heroes. And we must just go back and start again once more. You threw 4 years into the melting pot, did you indeed? These others cried. Oh, well, the more fool you. That's not actually what everybody said. A lot of people, it was understood they'd done their bit, they'd won, it was good, you know. But the people who came back were feeling, oh, the more fool me, nobody cares, nobody understands, nobody recognises. And we're beginning to agree with them. This was quite a bold thing. This was Vera Brittain becoming a pacifist, becoming somebody who said war is not good under any circumstances, and politicians should be able to stop wars by talking to one another, which they could have done in the First World War. There was plenty of opportunity, and the second. Well, Hitler was a different matter. That was the whole situation was much different.
Yes.
And
there
also
was an aggression.
And also, well, the First World War set all the minds in Germany against the consequences, and Hitler had a good opening for his politics, and so it was a rather different situation. But the First World War, the kings and the emperors, who were all cousins, they were all related, they could have got together and stopped it happening. And that's one of the real reasons why, after the Second World War, the European Union started. So they tried to get the European countries together as a unit, and now, of course, my country, Britain, is trying to get out of Europe, because once again they seem to think they're better than everybody else, and they don't need to have allies, and they think they don't need to have allies in Europe.
History repeating itself, isn't it?
Pardon? Well, again, the First World War was meant to be the war to end all wars. They said, we are in this terrible mess. If there is going to be a war, it will be the last one. We will have fought, and that will be the end of everything. But this was when Europe thought, well, okay, you know, America can have Iraq, Britain can have India. You know, that's not acceptable either. They thought, we'll sort it all out, but we'll send the French to rule in Syria or wherever, and we'll sort out Israel, and they still thought we know it all. We know better.
Why did she say demobilize?
Well, demobilize meaning that when you're mobilized, you go into war,
So
and when you're demobilized, you come out.
back.
So that's
Okay.
you get your official demobilization papers to show that you've been released from military service. And you're given you're allowed to walk around in your own clothes, because while you're still mobilized during the war, you're walking around in uniform, even when you're on leave. So I've managed to do it in just over an hour, and I hope you've got a nice selection of